Me and 3 of my friends decided to explore an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of our town. Nothing strange happened at first, but after about half an hour, we started hearing whispering and random doors closing. The building had supposedly been empty since the 1940s, so that alone was plenty creepy already. All 4 of us eventually entered what looked like an operating room. Then all of a sudden, the door we had come through slammed shut behind us, and the operating table in the center of the room slid across the floor at high speed and slammed into the wall. One of our friends called Matt left right then and there. Me and the other 2 stayed because we wanted to see more cool stuff happen. So being the 13-year-old geniuses that we were, we decided to go into the basement. That was when things really got weird. We wandered around for about 20 minutes and nothing seemed to be happening. So we turned around and tried to go back the way we had come. Except, the exit to the basement was no longer there. At first, we thought we had taken a wrong turn, but the basement was not even that big, and we spent almost 2 hours trying to get out of there. This was before cell phones were common, and none of us had one anyway. All the while, the whispering started again, and we kept seeing things out of the corner of our eyes everywhere. We were constantly asking each other, "Did you see that?" Eventually, we found our way out. When we walked outside, it was midday, around 1 p.m. We had gone in there around 11 p.m. the night before. We were confused, but at the time we just shrugged it off, not realizing how much time had actually passed. We started walking towards one of the guys' houses. After 5 minutes into the walk, a police car pulled up beside us and asked if we were our names. We said we were, and he replied, "There's a search party looking for you." Then he radioed something in, and we immediately realized we were in serious trouble. Here's the part that no one can explain. About 5 or 6 more police guards showed up along with our parents and Matt and his. Apparently after Matt left and went home, he realized none of us were there and got worried. He told his parents and called the police. A search party was organized because we had been missing for an entire day. We had gone into the hospital on a Friday night and did not emerge until Sunday. Matt had obviously panicked when he realized we were gone, and that's it. The police had searched the entire hospital and never found us, and when we asked whether they had checked the basement, they said they checked it several times. Still, while we were down there, we saw and heard no one. Where on earth did the time go? And while I waited at the desk, I could not stop noticing how the surfaces looked glossy and filthy at the same time. It almost felt like despair was clinging to the air. It felt less like a hospital and more like a prison. Eventually, an exhausted-looking woman appeared from the back of the office and told me someone would be along shortly to show me to the machine. I looked out the window at the heavy grey clouds overhead, which seemed even darker through the old tinting on the glass. A few minutes later, a man came shuffling down the empty sidewalk towards the building. He wore a dark khaki uniform and looked a little like a school janitor, except he was no older than 20 and had an oddly childlike face. His eyes were small and beady beneath a low, narrow brow. He had a strange bowl haircut and heavy black orthopedic shoes. His mouth wore a twisted expression, like he was trying to suck air through his teeth. I could not tell whether he were a patient or an employee. He moved so slowly that I spent the entire time debating his identity in my head. As he approached the door, I guessed patient, but I was wrong. He pulled a badge from his pocket, let himself in, and told me he was going to take me to the machine. At last, I thought. Time to get this done so that I can get the hell out of here. As I followed him on the 3-block walk to the building that housed the machine, I kept staring at the place around me. The grounds had streets and blocks, but they were sparse, lined with barrack-like brick buildings. There were no street signs and sidewalks, but it all felt empty. The building he led me to was especially bleak, My guide produced a giant ring of ancient keys and unlocked the crooked door, and, as if out of habit, kicked the door hard with his foot to get it open. When I followed him inside, I noticed the paint on the door was worn away in the exact spot where the generations of people had clearly done the same thing. Inside was a cramped hallway with closed doors on either side and a narrow staircase disappearing into the darkness. He flipped on a solitary bulb at the top of the stairs and paused while unlocking the door above us. Then he spoke. "Now I want you to know before we go in here, there are people in here." "Okay," I said. "It's a little strange," he replied. "Okay." It turned out he was a master of understatement. I stepped past him into the room and was greeted by something I still think about to this day. Around the perimeter of the room were small beds, and on them writhed a collection of the most miserable people I had ever seen. They were restrained by leather and canvas straps, and many had faces and bodies so warped by congenital abnormalities that they were barely recognizable as human. Blank eyes stared out from deep, sunken sockets in every direction. From behind a small curtain, some strange guttural choking sounds. Whatever was back there, I wondered. What could possibly be so awful that it needed to be shielded from these others? I struggled to get my bearings. The only light in the room came weakly through the panes of a single dormer window behind a dusty yellow curtain. It cast a pale beam across the wooden floor and left the rest of the building buried in shadow. The whole scene made it look like prisoners in the worst kind of horror story, condemned to never see beauty or hear laughter again. I turned to ask the man what on earth was going on, but the landing was empty. I walked to the window and saw him outside, pacing in little circles. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed the mail meter sitting awkwardly between two of the beds in the back of the room. I tried to focus on the job. I pulled out a small flashlight and turned it on the machine. At once I noticed the sounds around me growing worse. The people in the room were beginning to stir, as if they knew a stranger was there. The woman on the right of the machine was very thin and sallow, with lank red hair hanging over part of her face. To the left was a lumpy form I realized as a man, curled up to his knees, drawn towards, in an atrophied torso so twisted and crab-like that I was sure he had never left the bed. He stared at the ceiling and moaned in a thin, wavering voice that was probably one of the most pitiful sounds I have ever heard in my existence. I plugged the machine in and immediately understood why they had called. It started beeping and banging in a way that made it sound that it was falling apart from the inside. In fact, it was. A large gear had stripped, and the mechanism it controlled was grinding itself to dust. So I unplugged it right away, but not before the noise caused everyone in the room to start moaning and shrieking in a cacophony of misery that made my skin crawl. Then the red-haired woman began jerking violently, her hands clawing, beating the stained bedsheets beside her. Suddenly she sat bolt upright and reached for me. Had it not been for the strap holding onto her, she would have flown across the room at me. Her hair parted from her face as she stretched out her cramped, bony hand towards me. I could not even see the whites of her eyes, if she had any. She simply moaned. It sounded like her soul was trying to claw its way through the dark well of her throat and out the black hole of her mouth. I froze and stared at her until her mouth fell fully open, and the moan became even louder. I had to get out of there. I floated towards the door in a panic, just as my khaki-clad guide appeared at the top of the stairs. I brushed past him and tumbled down towards the exit, and burst outside like a sailor escaping a sinking ship. The man yelled at me, but I didn't hear what he said. "What?" I asked, glancing back. "You dropped your flashlight," he said. "Keep it," I replied, jogging to the parking lot. He shouted, "Wait," so I stopped running and turned. "What was wrong with the machine?" "It's dead," I said, and I quit the job the next day. The human body is made of electrical activity, and electrical activity is life. As you know from science, energy can never be destroyed, only converted. And when someone does something often enough, or their life ends in a traumatic or dramatic way, it leaves an impression on the atmosphere where it happened. And people who are sensitive to that kind of energy can sense it. And the more sensitive they are, the more they can feel, detect, or even see it. I have always been very sensitive to those energies, even when my grandmother died and came to me in my bedroom to tell me to take care of my mum just before the phone rang. I tried to convince myself I was dreaming, so I guess that it's my explanation for the things I have seen, felt, and experienced over the years, as well as the things other people saw and told me about. The first place I worked as an aide had once been the country poorhouse, so a couple of 100 years of living and dying had happened there. The old home is now the Historical Society and is open to the public. There is one building that still carries the name of the asylum, and our county disaster services agency had things stored there because I belonged to that unit. But I hated going in there, anywhere near dark, because you could feel the confusion, hate, and anger that still lingered there. Even in the light, you would see shadows and things that were not there. The new home was built, and everyone was moved in down the road in 1976. I started working there as an aide when I turned 18, and even though I have left several times, I still work there now as the restorative nurse. When I first started, there was a licensed practical nurse who had been grandfathered in from being an aide, and she had the best stories. Some of the things she told us would curl your hair, and I always just assumed they were just that, stories, but I was wrong. Even though the home was newly built and sat on farmland, I felt like all of the residents and maybe some of the energy had moved with them. Well, one night, I was working on one section when one of our residents died. A friend and I were cleaning him up to prepare him for the funeral process when the light above the sink started turning itself off and on. It was not just the light, the switch itself moved. I got out of that room as fast as I could. Another night, I was on the other end of the building, and we had 3 gentlemen in the ward who had lost their legs and their minds to untreated syphilis. A few rooms down, a woman we were expecting to die passed away. At that exact moment, one of the men in the ward sat up, started talking perfect sense, asked me some questions, and then went back to sleep. In that same building, the couple across the hall had a clock radio that the alarm no longer worked on, but they still listened to the radio. At the same time that woman died, the alarm went off and stayed on until we went to check on Olive and found that she had passed. These were mild stories. I do not know whether I was just as sensitive then or whether I ignored a lot of it, but things stayed about that level for a while. My grandmother lived in one of the old mansion homes in the area. She could have told you stories that would curl your hair too, but I always took them with a grain of salt. Still, you could sense a lot by just being in the home. Later, I went back to work there as an RN charge nurse just before they built the new home on the same ground. When the new building was finished, they tore down the old mansion home, but those energies moved into the new building faster than we could keep up with it. Call lights would turn off by themselves, lights would act up, keys would lock themselves inside locked rooms, and we only found them because the new home had surveillance cameras. Needless to say, I started believing my grandmother's stories after that. There was also a man in the old home who had died before I ever worked there, so I had never seen or heard of him before my grandmother passed away. Every night, I would see him walking down the hall from his room. When he crossed the threshold into the dining room, he would step very high, almost as if there were a big step there. It drove me nuts, so I finally asked some of the aides who had been there for a long time about him and described him, and they said, "Oh, that's just Flicky, he always did that." I sometimes think a lot of them stay there because they had nowhere else to go. Many of them came from the state hospital that had closed, and the staff really were their only family. There were several residents I would see often, doing exactly what they had done in life, looking and acting the same. Maybe it was just energy. Or maybe we were the only ones who had been there for them when they were alive, and for that reason they stayed after death as well. I used to work the night shift in long-term care, and there was one woman who would always come and sit with me at the nurse's desk. She sat in her wheelchair through the night and never bothered anyone. She just could not sleep and did not want to be alone in her room. Over time, I got to know Mary really well. She was dying of diabetes and kidney failure. A few months went by, and she developed sores on the lower half of her legs. She refused to have them amputated and said she knew she was dying and was ready. She and I would joke that it was not going to happen on my shift because I would not allow it. I got to know Mary's family too, since they were coming and going a lot. Then one rough night, she sat up in bed, looked at me, and started talking about the red aura around me. She also said there was a lady standing right behind me. My back was against the wall, and I can also say for sure that nobody was there. She also told her daughter that I was the twin of a baby who had died at birth. After that night, I guess I became part of her family in a way. About 3 weeks later, I had just come back from work after being gone 4 days. When I walked into Mary's room, she was laying there dying and had not been awake for 2 days. My adopted sister said Mary had been waiting for me to get back to work before she passed. I went in, said my goodbyes, and told her again that she could not go on my shift. We had joked during the long nights that when she did die, she was going to send me a signal so I would know she had made it there safely and everything would be all right. It was one of the little running jokes between us. Later that same shift, I was sitting with the aides when a call light went off in a room at the end of an empty hall. It was spooky enough already because there were only 5 of us there. We went to check the room, but there were no lights showing, even though the call lights were still going off. We all looked at each other, and as we left the room, I sent 2 aides down the hall to do a check while the other 2 went the opposite way. They came back to me and said Mary was gone. The moment I heard that, the call light stopped. I started crying and laughing at the same time. I was sad about her passing, but in my own strange way, I think the call light was her way of saying she had gotten where she was supposed to be, and that everything was going to be all right. And she kept her promise to me. My grandfather was one of 4 boys and 1 girl. When he was dying of cancer in the hospital, family members took turns staying with him at night, so someone would be there when he passed. It happened to be my dad's night, and he had fallen asleep in the chair next to my grandfather when something woke him up. The door suddenly slammed open, which of course is something it should never do on its own. He was expecting to see someone in the doorway, but when he opened his eyes, he was blinded by a white light. When the light dimmed, he looked into the doorway and saw the figures of a man and a woman, along with 3 little boys and a girl. They walked over to my grandfather's bed, and my grandfather sat up straight. They began chatting to each other, and then my grandfather lay back down. As the figures walked back towards the door, there were suddenly 4 little boys and a girl. My grandfather died as he lay back down after speaking with them. I believe it was his siblings coming to take him on to what happens after. I'd like to preface this by saying that not all mental health professionals are terrible people. Good doctors and medication have saved my life. I also did not grow up in the United States, so if something in this story makes you think, that's not how it works, keep in mind that in other countries, they have different laws and procedures. This story also includes experiences I had while staying in a mental hospital, so please be aware that it could be triggering. But with that said, here we go. I was a troubled kid, and honestly, I'm kind of a troubled person in general, but when I was in my early teens, specifically 14 in this story, I was cutting and contemplating inhuming myself and refusing to go to school. Because of that, I was put on the waiting list for a children's mental hospital. I know now that the fact I was on the waiting list for nearly half a year should have been my first warning sign. Now, at the time, I honestly enjoyed being on sick leave from school, which basically meant I got to play The Sims until 6 AM for 5 months straight. But when it came time to actually pack up my things and go to the hospital, obviously I did not want to go. I wanted help, sure, don't get me wrong, but the idea of being away from home for 6 whole weeks terrified me. That was the standard amount of time they kept you in order to observe you, work out a diagnosis, and then decide whether you wanted to continue treatment afterwards. My mother drove me. The whole way there, I shuddered with anxiety. The sky was grey, almost forecasting my despair, and by the time I arrived, I was in tears. It was a struggle to get me out of the car, but when she finally did, I walked up to my doom, with my mother carrying my suitcases for me. The large building, backlit by the grey sky, only increased my sense of foreboding. I entered through the large double doors for the crescendo of my anxiety to hit, and was immediately met by the nurses who had been expecting me. I can see right away that I did not want to be there. We walked through several hallways until we were taken to a doctor's office and made to wait. I pleaded with my mother that I didn't want to be there, but it was no use, and before long the doctor in a white coat arrived. The first thing he asked me was if I was here of my own free will. Of course, I shook my head. From there it spiraled. They shrugged it off and said they could get a court decision forcing me to stay. I never did get to speak to a judge. I never got to defend or explain myself or anything. As far as I knew, my parents didn't speak to a judge either. A judge simply reviewed my medical history and signed a piece of paper that forced me to stay there for those 6 weeks. My suitcase was searched, and I remember feeling as if I had just arrived in prison, and, in a way, I think I had. The first terrifying thing happened on my first night. As someone who cut, my arms were in terrible shape. When wounds heal, they itch, and I scratched open some of my old scabs. I went to the nurse to request bandages, and they lost their minds. Because from their point of view, I had just intentionally harmed myself. They could not prove it, but that did not seem to matter. So what did you do when a 14-year-old mental patient harms herself? Do you talk to her? Do you try to help her? No. They took away all my jewelry, including a necklace from my mother and a bracelet from my ex-girlfriend, who I still had very strong feelings for at the time, and they sent me to the timeout room for 24 hours. The timeout room was small, with a large window and just enough space for a bed. If I needed the bathroom, I had to ask a nurse to escort me. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that at one point I was in the bathroom with a nurse. standing guard outside the door. She asked if I was okay, and I sarcastically said, "No, I'm cutting myself with the toilet paper." She said, "Really?" and immediately ripped the door open. Christ, man. All of my clothes, including my underwear and pajamas, were taken from my room and stored in the front office for as long as I stayed in the timeout room. So whenever I needed clothes, I had to go to the front office to request them. Apart from asking for clothes and being escorted to the bathroom, I was completely left alone in that room. No one ever checked on me. Getting out of the timeout room was not much better. For the first week or two, I had horrible stomach problems. I would wake up multiple times a night, needing to use the bathroom. Which, by the way, was not in my room. I had to walk down the stairs to use the communal bathrooms. Because my stomach kept me awake all night, I often did not get enough sleep and ended up sleeping through the day. That meant I missed group activities. Instead of waking me up, I got yelled at and was told, and I quote, if I was up all night roaming the halls, I'd be tired too. What, did they want me to just crap on the bed or something? And because I did not participate in group activities, I could not earn outside time. Yes, I had to earn the luxury of going outside. Even sitting on the front steps with a nurse beside me had to be earned. So, for the first 6 weeks, I was effectively locked up, except for school and weekends, when I was allowed to go home. It was painfully obvious that none of the nurses cared about the patients. They were not even nurses, really. They were more like prison guards. One of them resembled a homeless guy. Another sounded like she had smoked 5 packs a day her whole life. And all of them, every single one, were chain smokers. Any free moment they had, they used them as smoke breaks. Right outside the door, too, with the doors open, so all the other kids who were going through nicotine withdrawal could smell it. I saw a real nurse once a week. She mostly checked for self-harm. One time, I had self-harmed at home over the weekend, and I told her that it was in fact my pet bunny, and she bought it. In 6 weeks at the hospital, I saw a psychiatrist exactly 2 times. Once for a general introduction, and once for an IQ test. Oh, and did I mention that you were allowed to have razors in the shower? Or the huge bird spider that sat in one corner of the shower the entire time I was there? Or the cobwebs and silverfish, which were everywhere? Anyone who has ever struggled with mental illness probably is aware of the phrase, "just pull yourself together," or "get over it," are some of the least helpful things you can say. And I heard that sort of thing constantly. There was one instance where another patient, who was terrified of spiders, came running out of her room in a near panic because she had woken up with a spider directly on her face. Know what they told her? "Don't be such a baby, it's just a spider." They gave her a broom so she could get rid of it herself, which of course she could not do. My roommate and I ended up helping her, and both of us were afraid of spiders also. But the most outrageous thing happened on my second to last day. Someone told the guards that I had smuggled in a razor blade, so they pulled me out of breakfast and searched me from top to bottom, stripping me naked with the nurse's room door wide open for everyone to see my bare buttocks. When they did not find a razor blade on me, and let me make it quite clear that they searched every part of me, they tore my room apart. They didn't find one there either, but they did find one lying on the floor in the hallway that was still in its wrapper. I was not the only patient who cut herself. As a matter of fact, I do not think there was a single female patient who did not cut herself. The blade could have belonged to anyone. There was no proof whatsoever that it belonged to me. Of course, they decided it was mine anyway. Even though I did not have any new cuts on my arm, I was thrown back into the timeout room for another 24 hours, and that was literally my last stay there. And because they paid so little attention while you were in the timeout room, other patients who did have razor blades were able to slip a letter with a razor blade inside under the door, where I took out my frustrations on myself. In case any of you were wondering where my parents were in all of this, my mother wanted to get me out of there as soon as she heard about the timeout room, but my parents had joint custody, so she needed my father to agree. My father deserves a whole story of his own, but to keep this short, he had not spoken to me at this point in over 4 years, yet somehow he believed I needed help and refused to let me out. My final diagnosis from that place was narcissistic neurosis. I was 14. To this day, I have no idea how they come up with any diagnosis at all, considering I had seen an actual doctor exactly twice. This result was delivered to my parents and me by the head doctor of the hospital, a man who I had never seen before in my life, during a so-called conclusive meeting on my last day. I was offered the chance to remain and begin behavioral therapy, but I think it goes without saying that I respectfully declined. Every therapist and psychiatrist I have spoken to since then, and trust me, there have been several over the last 7 years, have dismissed that diagnosis completely. Some have even laughed at it. I'm currently diagnosed with bipolar disorder, depression, and panic disorder, and my current psychiatrist has suggested I may have borderline personality disorder. I guess the moral of the story is to research any hospital before you agree to go there. I sure as hell hope I never have to see any of those guards, nurses, or doctors again. I used to work at a hospital as a CNA. My shift started at 2 p.m. and was supposed to end at 11 p.m. However, if I had to train the girl who worked nights, that meant I stayed until 4:30 in the morning. Being a nurse tech was hard work, so by 2 or 3 in the morning you can probably imagine how tired and sleep-deprived I was. Well, one night, I was working one of these long shifts. We did rounds every hour, and as we were going through the halls, a resident requested a nurse. So we told the nurse she was needed, and kept moving, since we already had checked on everyone during rounds. It was a typical night otherwise. All the other residents were asleep. We went back to the nurse's station and sat down, while the nurse stayed in the resident's room talking softly. Then, very suddenly, and very loudly, we heard the loudest baby cry I have ever heard. Immediately, we knew something was wrong. I shot up out of my chair and immediately tried to figure out where the sound had come from. The strangest part was that it seemed to come from everywhere all at once. It did not echo from hall to hall. It sounded like the cry was coming from all 3 halls around us. I told my coworker to check the patient again. Nothing had happened or changed. Everyone was still asleep. And at first I thought that perhaps I was in denial. So I asked my coworkers if they'd heard the same thing. They all had. We waited until the nurse came out of the resident's room and asked if she had heard it too. She said she had, but she did not know how to react because she was with a resident and did not want to freak them out. That place used to be a regular hospital, and there was a morgue on the bottom floor. A lot of nurses hated working nights because of the strange things they said they experienced there. I will never forget that blood-curdling baby cry, and still cannot explain it. Working the 3 to 11 shift in a nursing home, I was in the middle of my medication pass when a CNA called me into a resident's room. The moment I walked in, the CNA said, "I think she just died while I was changing her." I checked for breathing, circulation, and reviewed the patient's orders. She was a DNR. I tried to get her blood pressure, but there was nothing, no response at all. After that, I called the patient's son to let him know what happened. He asked for his mother to be sent to the emergency room to be pronounced, and then they would go straight to the hospital from there. I followed protocol and called 911 to arrange the transfer for pronouncement. Then I summoned the ambulance. About 20 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. The paramedic and the EMT went through the same checks I had already done: breathing, circulation, blood pressure. They got nothing either. By the time they loaded her up, covered her and pulled away, 30 to 40 minutes had passed. On our way to the local hospital, the ambulance had to cross a railroad track. When it did, the patient suddenly sat up, pulled the sheet off her face, and started pointing and shaking her hand at the paramedic while screaming, take me back right now, I mean it, take me back." The EMT driving pulled over to see what was going on. The paramedic got out of the ambulance and immediately pulled up. After that, they continued on the way to the hospital, and the paramedic later called the nursing home to tell them what happened. About an hour later, the son called and said he had been surprised to arrive at the emergency room and have his mother greet him. He asked me if I had performed CPR while speaking with him because he knew I was a DNR. When the family heard about the whole thing, they just said it just wasn't her time. The only explanation I can come up with even now is that the bumps from the railroad crossing jolted her heart back into rhythm. It's the best I got. I still think about it sometimes, and it remains one of the strangest things I have ever seen. The part that gets me most is that everyone involved had already checked her and found nothing. So the moment she sat up felt impossible in real time. Oh, and it gets better. The paramedic resigned after his shift ended the next morning. That alone tells you how much that experience shook him. I, of course, have no idea whether the railroad crossing actually restarted her heart or whether something else was at play. But that was honestly the only theory that could ever make any sense to me. I have worked in healthcare for a number of years. I worked with mentally and physically disabled people in a privately owned residential setting. Each house holds up to 14 residents. The house I worked in had lost a resident to heart failure the year before. I worked the evening shift, and near the end of one shift, my co-worker Riley and I were cleaning up and getting food ready for the next day's meal, and all of the residents were already in bed. That's when I heard knocking on one of the bathroom doors down the west hall, which was visible from the kitchen. My colleague stayed in the kitchen while I went to check it out. There was no one near the bathroom and no one inside, but as I stood there I heard the knocking again. It was enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. I ran back to the kitchen, and that was when I saw my colleague pointing in surprise towards the end of the hall I had just come from. Because there, standing at the fire door, was a man in a plaid shirt wearing dark-rimmed glasses and blue pants. He waved at us. I knew he was not a resident, but I called out to him. There were no lights in the hall, but we could still make out what he looked like because of the light from the kitchen and the exit sign. I reluctantly walked down the hall and flipped on the light. The second the light came on, the man disappeared. I thought I might be losing my mind, but my colleague had seen him too. We told the night shift about it later, and Juanita just laughed and said, "Hey, come here, honey, I want to show you something." She was a bubbly woman and pulled out a scrapbook and pointed it to a picture of a man in the same hat I had seen in the hall. I asked if that was him, and she said it was. When I asked how she knew, she chuckled and said that it was Henry. He likes to say hi to new people, he isn't harmful, and that he died last year and his room was down there. That was the first time I realized the house might have had someone who stayed around after death. It was unsettling in the moment, but knowing he was harmless, made me feel a little less scared afterwards. While working night shift in our ICU and CCU, we had several patients die in room 11 over the course of the previous week. It was on that night that the room was empty, the glass door was closed, and the unit itself was eerily quiet. That is when, out of nowhere, the call light for room 11 began going off, and the light over the bed turned on by itself. I looked at the monitor technician, and she looked back at me, and we both shuddered. Why would the call light go off in an empty room? And how did the light turn on without anyone touching it? It was definitely spooky. And after that, we called it the haunted room for several years. Over the years, I have also had many patients tell me they were going to die, or that a dead family member was there to take them, and then they passed away shortly after. That does not feel spooky to me so much as it reminds you that people often know when they are near the end, and we should listen to them when they say something feels wrong. A lot of the time they are not afraid, because these visitors seem to bring a calming presence. For example, I once had an elderly woman who was doing well after an acute myocardial infarction tell me she was not going to make it. I told her she was doing fine at the moment and asked what made her feel that way. She said the angels were coming for her, and then she immediately went into cardiac arrest and we were unable to resuscitate her. That was the fastest I have ever had someone die after telling me they were about to do so. I used to work in a 6-bed PICU, and one night I was there late with another nurse and a CNA. The room at the very end of the unit was empty, and honestly the whole place felt unusually quiet. As we sat at the nurse's station, we heard a beeping sound twice in a row. We all recognized it immediately, but none of us could place where it was coming from. Every few minutes it would happen again, and we kept trying to figure out what it was. We kept saying it was a sound we heard every day, but could not remember which device made it. Eventually, we followed the sound down the unit and into the vacant room. That's when we realized the beeping was the same double beep our beds made in the morning when we weighed patients. The strange part was that there was no patient in the bed. Of course, at first we assumed the bed was simply malfunctioning, but when we checked, the bed was actually unplugged from the wall, with the plug laying on top of the mattress itself. Now, we tried to explain it away by thinking maybe the battery was low, but these beds do not even have batteries. When they are unplugged, nothing on them works. On top of that, there was occasionally a crying baby sound that came from that room too, which really unsettled all of us on night shift. It was the kind of thing that makes the quiet unit feel immediately spooky. I used to work for a company that sold and repaired mail meters. It was a strange job, and I met a lot of strange people doing it, but this was by far the most bizarre experience I had. There is a facility here called the State Hospital. It's a public institution spread across about 30 acres in the middle of town, surrounded by a high fence and next to a military base. The place is basically a small campus of old, derelict, red brick buildings that house people with mental disorders ranging from moderate to severe. None of the buildings are new, and many date back to the turn of the last century. The trip to the reception building already felt like stepping back in time. It looked like an orphanage from a fever dream. I was checked in at the main office, which was modern compared with the residents' quarters I had passed on the drive in, but it still had an unpleasant feeling to it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The walls were institutional green. Way back in 1996, I was working at a hospital on the outskirts of a large city. It was a fairly new hospital, but it had been built on the grounds of a large Victorian insane asylum. The old Victorian building was still there, and still very much in use as a mental health facility. Part of the hospital complex included accommodation for staff. That is where I was living, alone, in one of the flats in the newer section of the buildings. After I had been there for a few weeks, I began noticing something strange. Every time I was just falling asleep, someone would shout my name. It didn't matter what time it was. It happened after day shifts, after night shifts, and even if I was just dozing on the sofa during the day, without fail, my name would be called. I could not tell whether the voice was male or female, but it was deep. Not only that, I also had a bead curtain that would sometimes move on its own, but in a very specific way, as though someone were running their hands across it. It would undulate and ripple, but it did not move like it would if the wind had caught it through an open window. This was different. Then there was my phone. Back in those days, mobile phones were rare, so I had an old-fashioned home phone with a bell that rang in the same way an old alarm clock did. Along with the curtain movement and the voice calling my name, the phone would sometimes make a noise like someone had flicked the bell. It would happen as a sequence of 3 taps at random times. After a few weeks of getting more and more tired from the interrupted sleep, I finally got irritated enough to speak out loud to the room. I firmly but politely explained the situation and asked whatever it was to let me sleep. I got back into bed, tried to fall asleep again, and just as I was drifting off, the voice changed. Instead of calling my name, it went shh, like the way someone would comfort a sleeping child. It continued for a few days, but then cut out completely, and after that everything was gone. I have no idea who or what it was, but it was certainly real. This story comes from my dad, who worked as a security guard at the hospital in our small town. The hospital was built in 1908, first established in a mining community and later turned into a nursing home for miners. My dad's job was to walk the building, lock up the offices, and make sure no one was still wandering around after 10 p.m. The building had 3 floors. The bottom floor held the basement and the old morgue. The second floor had the meeting offices, the kitchen gym, dialysis center, and visitor bathrooms. The top floor was where the elderly residents stayed and received care. My dad said that one night at around 11 p.m., he was walking the second floor and locking up the bottom visitor door while checking the offices for anyone still there. As he passed the men and women's visitor bathroom near the gym, he heard something from the women's restroom. A woman cough. It was a loud, harsh, and obnoxious cough, and right after that, he heard a paper towel being torn from the dispenser, and everything went quiet. He stopped outside the door and waited, expecting someone to leave, but no one did. He waited a little longer, and still nothing happened. So finally he resigned himself to gingerly push the door open. As he did, he looked inside and called out, "Ma'am?" But no one answered him. The lights in the toilet were off, and the sound of the door opening all the way echoed down the hallway. He flicked the light on. He checked both stalls and the small shower in the restroom, but everything was empty. Then he looked near the trash can and noticed a small piece of torn paper towel scrunched up and thrown away. He quickly walked out of the restroom and left it alone. To this day, he says that cough was clear as day and cannot explain it. My grandma is around 80 years old, and she shared this story with me recently. She has a project where she's trying to write down some of her best and worst memories of her life, a memoir to her grandchildren. I have helped her and sat down with her in order to get some of these stories out of her, to coax the details and really understand the stories themselves. There is one story though, something that happened to her when she was in her 30s, that I was completely unaware of, and even my parents were completely unaware of, and it really struck a chord with me. I think it would be right to share it with you today. Back then, my grandma was a nun. I'm not entirely sure how it used to work, but it seemed like you were a nun for a specific amount of time and then you could sort of drop out. At least, that's how I understood it. She said that it was different back then. I suppose it was. And as she was working as a nun, she was working in a hospital as well. In the hospital, she worked as a nurse and had a collection of other nun and nurse friends. One of her friends was called Flor, which means flower in Spanish. Her friend Flor was a nun as well. They had been tending to a bunch of patients. The one I want to specifically focus on was a man who was about 20 years older than my grandma and Flor at the time. He must have been hovering somewhere in his late 40s, and seeing as Flor was the person who attended him the most, he became infatuated with her. Every time another nurse would come by to assist, he would demand that Flor be the one to come and help, even on days that she wasn't working. It became a little bit toxic, but at the time they didn't really think about that and just tried their best to meet his needs. On the day he was discharged, Flor wasn't there, and I think, according to my grandma anyway, that pissed him off. Flor never got to say bye. Not that she particularly cared for the man. She was a very dedicated person and had plenty of other patients to attend to, as the hospital was already overrun as it was. Now, the hospital was not new by any means, and had a bit of a reputation among the staff that there was a spook haunting part of the hospital. It was said that on some nights, if you listened closely, you could hear someone wailing in the halls, and if you went to look, you might even see the spectre for yourself. Flor nor my grandma never saw anything, but all the same, the rumor spread among the staff, and nurses spread it around. Well, one day, Flor and my grandma are working the late shift. They were both tired, sitting in the nurse's station, and as most of the patients were asleep, there was a brief lull in their work. Just as they're having a chat and relaxing, do they hear someone down the hall? Immediately, Flor jumps, assuming it was the ghost, and says that they should go investigate it together. But they're both scared, even though they didn't believe it was definitely a scary time. And so they both held each other's hands like grown-ass women and make their way towards the dimly lit corridor to see where the noise is coming from. They can hear it coming from just outside a window at the end of the corridor, and they slowly make their way. By the time they get to the end of the corridor, they look down the window from where the noise is coming from and see the patient, the one who had a crush on Flor. He was there howling and making moaning sounds into the window. They were relieved it wasn't a ghost, but now pissed. My grandma opens the window and screams, "Hey, stop scaring the patients." It was only at that moment that they noticed who it was. As before, given the darkness, they couldn't really tell. The man says nothing. Once he was detected, he just ran off. They thought that was the end of it. They wondered why he would come back and try and freak them out. Who had told him the story, and why he was trying to pretend he was a ghost is far beyond them. Well, 3 days later, my grandma is just arriving at work. She sees some of her friends and starts talking to them while getting ready for the day, when there's a scream coming from the main entrance. They all start running towards the entrance to see if there's some kind of medical emergency that needs their immediate attention. But the man has come back. He's screaming, holding a gun, and demanding to tell them where Flor is. They tell him to get out. There was no security guards or anyone protecting the hospital in those times, or at least not where they lived, and everyone starts to panic. The guy then shoots the gun into the ceiling of the hospital and demands again to see Flor. The staff and people around are compliant and say that she's just upstairs. My grandma says to the man that he'll take her but that he needs to put the gun away, and he refuses and threatens to hit her and shoot her. So my grandma, being the brave woman she is, decides to escort the man to make sure Flor doesn't come to any harm, and takes him to the stairs. This is of course the same man who was pretending to be the ghost the other night. As they're climbing the stairs, she's aware that Flor should be working on the second floor today, and when she makes it up to the second floor, she calls out from one of the patient wards, and her and the man start coming over. My grandma insists to the man that there are patients here who could get seriously hurt and have already suffered enough, and to put the gun away. He reluctantly puts it in his pocket, and then when she reaches Flor, she asks the man what he needs, but didn't know yet that he had a gun. The man was telling her that he came to confess his love to him. Flor was taken aback and reminded the man that she had taken a vow of celibacy, and said that she was a nun and intended to be so a while longer, and that if he waited, maybe when she was done, she could marry him. But this wasn't enough for the man, and he pulled out the gun and said that if he didn't agree to marry her now, she would pay the price. She didn't reply straight away. She kept staring down at the gun, absolutely terrified, and before she even had a chance to get a word out, he shot her. The sound rang out through the hospital, and all noise seemed to die the moment the shot rang out. After a few seconds, screams could be heard from everywhere as panic ensued. Flor was bleeding. She had been shot straight in the chest. The man, seemingly doing this out of a fit of passion, now realized what he had done, turns the gun on himself, and ended it right there. My grandma was momentarily paralyzed with what had just happened, until Flor said, "Help me," as she held her and tried to get her into a chair and find something to stop the blood. From there, my grandma says, it was all just a blur. She was on autopilot and tried the very best she could to save her friend. By some miracle, Flor survived, but she was never the same after that. After her recovery, she decided that she was done being a nun and working in a hospital, and left the country completely, and she lost touch. But she says that that was one of the most scariest moments of her entire life, to see her friend shot like that. The man, of course, died pretty much instantly, and there was no sympathy for him. It just goes to show what some creeps are capable of when they get obsessed. Be careful out there, friends. Years ago, I worked as an orderly on the night shift in a small hospital. Most of the work was routine. I would answer call lights, help with basic care, clean up whatever needed cleaning, and a bunch of other tasks. There was, however, one room that always gave me chills, and I'm about to explain why. You see, the call light in that room would seemingly go off on its own. Sometimes the patients inside would deny pressing it, and there would be times the call light would go off, and when I would go to investigate, there would be no one in that room at all. At first, everyone treated it like an odd hotel glitch, but the pattern kept repeating itself, and after a while, it stopped feeling like a mere coincidence. The older nurses had a story about it. They said an elderly woman called Vicky had spent a lot of time in that room before she passed, and that she was the one setting off the call light because she still wanted help. We all laughed about it. It became a running joke. Whenever something strange happened in that room, someone would say, "Vicky's looking for attention again." At that time, I didn't think much of it. 35 years passed. After a full career, I found myself working in that same hospital again as part of my retirement job. It was my swan song, and a lot had changed by then. Vicky's old room had been converted into a surgical area. It was bright, shiny, and new. The place looked nothing like it had back in the old days, but the memory of that room never left me. Now whenever I walk past the area and the lights are off, I sometimes swear I can see someone standing at the PACU out of the corner of my eye. It's probably an optical illusion. Hospitals and low lighting can play tricks on your mind, but I wonder if she's still there, needing help. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you have enjoyed tonight's collection of scary hospital stories, and if of course you have, you can let me know down below. Your comments and thoughts are always very much appreciated. But until next time guys, take care and good night.